What would you do if a second shower, a silver tube, and a folder named groceries were all it took to expose the life you thought you knew? Tonight's story follows Ethan, a quiet mapmaker of truth who chooses evidence over rage. A chat thread with a man named Victor. Thursdays that stretch past midnight. A premium circle that turns betrayal into logistics. A morality clause buried in a prenup. HR letters, spreadsheets, and a neighbor 2 floors up. This isn't a loud explosion of revenge. It's a calm, lawful refusal to live in the dark. You're watching Cheating Stories 7. If high-stakes betrayal and justice told with receipts is your thing, tap like, subscribe, and tell me what you'd do in Ethan's place. Now breathe in, steady yourself, and step into the first scene, the Tuesday tell. Tuesday was meant to be an ordinary day, one of those forgettable weekdays that slips by without leaving a trace. But it wasn't. I noticed the second shower first, the extra hum behind the thin bathroom door, citrus-scented steam drifting into the bedroom, making it smell less like home and more like a hotel at noon. Dana never took 2 showers in one day. She was predictable, morning rinse, evening lotion, asleep by 9. But that night, the water ran too long, as if it was trying to wash away words she couldn't say. On the dresser, her tote slouched open in careless invitation. Receipts fanned out like feathers, hair ties coiled into question marks, and then the sleek silver tube. It rested across the lining, deliberate and out of place, like a fountain pen displayed in velvet. It didn't belong to our life. It belonged to another story, one with elevators and whispered rendezvous, late checkouts, and dim hotel bars. I picked it up gently, the way you handle a fragile ornament you don't remember buying. Cool, polished, expensively designed. Then I placed it back exactly where it had been, as if precision could undo suspicion. That's when I noticed the glow of the tablet on the desk. A folder named Groceries sat there, pretending to be helpful. Dana doesn't shop by app. She prefers paper lists, scribbled notes, warnings about buying the wrong pasta sauce. I tapped it anyway. Inside, a plain chat icon waited, calm but familiar. At the top of the thread was a short name, Victor. The messages weren't romantic poetry, they were logistics. Thursday rooms, numbers, a repeated request for the silver one. Words can be louder than slamming doors. These were quiet, but they rearranged the furniture of my memory all the same. Every late meeting stretched longer in hindsight. Every I'm wiped out begged to be reconsidered. I didn't take screenshots. Not yet. I didn't smash the tablet or tear through drawers. I closed the app. I set the device back in place, and then I stood still until my heartbeat remembered its rhythm. There are different kinds of men you can become in a moment like that. Some ignite, burning the night with rage and justification. Others collapse, dissolving into grief until morning erases them. I chose neither. I chose the quiet mapmaker. The one who believes truth repeats itself at a pace you can chart. If I was wrong, proof would save us. If I was right, proof would save me. Either way, I needed a map, so I began. Shower at 8:10 p.m., longer than usual. Tablet awake at 8:24. Tote unzipped at 8:26. Numbers whispered like a prayer to a god called evidence. I knew I would need help, an attorney, perhaps an investigator. Husbands, after all, make terrible photographers when rage guides their hands. I needed to know what could be documented, what could hold up when the storm came. The shower stopped. Silence pressed hard against the door. Dana stepped out wrapped in the white towel I had bought last winter. She looked like the obedient version of our life, smiling warmly, asking about my day. Then she mentioned an early meeting, her voice light, her eyes sliding to the left. I filed it away, 8:33 p.m., early meeting, slight pause before the words, not belief but data. We ate together. I answered her with counterfeit calm while cardboard food sat heavy in my mouth. I matched her rhythm, smiled when she laughed, pretended we were fine. At 10, the lights went out. In the dark, I repeated my decision, not to be a saboteur, not to be a martyr, but to be a father with steady hands, guided not by fury but by facts. The night was long but not empty. It held a plan, a fragile, silent map of what was to come. Suspicion is easier to bear when it can be measured. After that Tuesday night, Ethan began counting, small, ordinary details that might otherwise have dissolved into routine. The soft chime of the elevator at odd hours. The subtle pause before Dana typed something on her calendar labeled client prep. The way silence stretched until dawn when she claimed late meetings. Each fragment alone was harmless, but together they began to sketch a rhythm. Ethan transferred those fragments into a spreadsheet, row by row, as if organization could shrink chaos. Columns for dates, columns for times, claimed activities, observed activities. At first the rows looked innocent, disconnected, but soon they began to rhyme in ways he could no longer ignore. 6 weeks in, the pattern had grown teeth. Twice, a neighbor mentioned offhand that Dana came home after midnight carrying a gym bag. Dana had never owned a gym bag. Ethan didn't confront her, not yet. He simply wrote it down, tagged it as anecdotal, and left a blank space for corroboration. The discipline felt alien. His body begged for confrontation, but his mind insisted on structure. Before adding another note, he booked a consultation with a family attorney. The office was plain, the advice colder than expected. The attorney explained boundaries as if reciting grammar rules. What could be documented inside his own home? What belonged to shared accounts? What evidence would crumble under legal scrutiny? Rage wanted shortcuts. The law demanded patience. Ethan left with a checklist, feeling like he had been handed handrails on a staircase he never wanted to descend. Back home, he gathered his work. Clean copies of timelines tucked into sheet protectors, a binder with color-coded tabs organized like a quiet archive of betrayal, then a duplicate binder driven to his brother's house in case the original ever vanished, one for the desk, one for the what-if. At dinner, Dana was radiant, humming about a colleague's promotion, fork tapping against her plate in rhythm with her story. She looked ordinary. Ordinary, Ethan realized, was the loudest sound in the room. He matched her tempo, kept his pulse steady, rehearsed calm the way athletes rehearse breath. He knew one theatrical outburst could ruin everything. Certainty wasn't something you could scream into existence. It had to be built, one line, one column, one quiet night at a time. Thursday arrived with the precision of a clock, steady and merciless, as if the week itself had been rehearsed. Dana dressed with the same calm excuses, slipped on the same shoes reserved for so-called client dinners, and left with the same perfumed silence in her voice. Ethan didn't follow. He knew better by now. Husbands, he reminded himself, make terrible investigators. Too much heart, too much noise. So he hired someone licensed, impartial, someone who could watch without shaking. Inside the apartment, Ethan stayed focused on what he was legally allowed to observe. The tablet on Dana's desk became his compass. He installed a trigger, carefully set and time-stamped, designed to wake only if she unlocked the device past midnight. Not invasive, just precise. An alarm bell waiting in the dark. At 11:47 p.m., the alarm stirred, keys pressed with the hush of secrecy. A muffled laugh escaped the silence, too soft for most ears but not for his. Dana believed her sleeping pills disguised her movements. She didn't know her quiet was now louder than any lie. Across the city, the investigator made his own entry in the record. At the exact same time, Dana checked into a downtown hotel, the very one Ethan had seen in the chat thread. The usual. That's what the messages had called it. The front desk clerk greeted her like routine, timestamp logging her presence with the neutrality of paperwork. Ethan didn't rage. He didn't smash dishes or pace the floor. Instead, he sat at the kitchen table where 3 envelopes waited like vows. The first was labeled past, printed screenshots, itemized phone bills, and the earliest bones of a timeline no one could ignore. The second was present, a restrained letter, asking for honesty that either lived now or never. The third was later, a custody plan centered on his daughter, her mornings protected, her homework steady, her life untouched by adult chaos. Each envelope was a map of time itself, what had been, what was, and what must come. By 2:00 a.m., he allowed himself 2 hours of sleep. Clarity was not a gift, he realized. It was a discipline. At 4:19, the door clicked open. Dana slipped inside, careful as a thief. She went straight to the sink, washing her hands longer than water ever demanded, scrubbing at something more than skin. Then she slid into bed beside him, exhaling like someone rehearsing peace. Ethan didn't move. He stared at the wall, where the first thin slice of daylight climbed like truth, rising whether people wanted it or not. He knew then the future would not be one with plates smashed or accusations hurled across a room. It would be one with small, unglamorous decisions, logs dated carefully, pages signed, patience practiced like prayer. Anger begged him to create a scene, but for once Ethan chose calm, and in that choice the map grew sharper. Patterns do not arrive with fanfare. They build themselves in silence, one detail at a time, until you can no longer pretend not to see. By the fourth week, Ethan's notes aligned with the investigator's photographs like frames in a reel of film. Dana's Thursdays stretched longer, bending around the same cluster of hours. Expense charges began to repeat. Hotel restaurants, rideshare trips to the same addresses, spa add-ons disguised as wellness. None of it screamed betrayal on its own. But when stacked together, the papers whispered louder than shouts. A new name appeared in the chat thread, Fiona. Not a stranger, not a shadow. Fiona, the book club friend who had once sipped wine in their living room, laughing about fictional husbands in paperback novels. At first, her messages seemed harmless. See you in the lobby. But Ethan overlaid them with hotel footage, parking-level badge scans, time-stamped receipts. Harmless words became coordinates. Coordinates became evidence. Ethan trained himself not to interpret emotions, only movements. He left guessing to drama and trusted the measurable. The candy bowl at the front desk, changing with the seasons, peppermints in December, lemon drops in spring. The bellman greeting Victor by name without hesitation. Details so ordinary they were undeniable. Details that juries remember. His attorney guided him further. Chain of custody. Not parental custody, though both mattered now. She taught him to date every page, initial every corner, separate conclusions from exhibits. She warned him, theatrics tempt, but theatrics crumble under cross-examination. Truth, even boring truth, survives. Ethan listened and obeyed. Most afternoons, he still played the role of father. School pickup, sneakers untied in hallways that smelled of crayons and mud. His daughter's chatter about spelling tests and playground victories reminded him why he was doing this. It wasn't to destroy Dana, not to humiliate Victor, not even to punish Fiona. The point was mornings that stayed intact, backpacks zipped, routines untouched. Revenge was loud, seductive in its drama. Stewardship was heavier, unglamorous, demanding, but he chose heavy. The map was no longer theory, it was real. A quiet structure taking shape, line by line, date by date, etched in ink that would not fade. The lawyer's office smelled of leather and coffee gone cold, a place where emotions shrank into contracts. Ethan carried binders of timelines and photographs, but what he walked out with weighed far more than paper. The attorney flipped through their prenuptial agreement, stopping on a page he barely remembered signing. A morality clause, words that tied marital assets to reputation, choices, misuse. Not a weapon, not a loophole, more like a staircase, narrow, steady, leading down into ground he had hoped never to touch. Relief flickered, followed by grief. Relief because there was now a framework, a legal language for justice that didn't depend on fury. Grief, because this clause proved their marriage had once required armor, even before betrayal took root. He nodded anyway, accepted the copy, and realized his battle was no longer only about Dana's secrets. It was about proving she had gambled with their shared life like collateral. Around that same week, while cleaning the hall closet, Ethan found the second tote. It was buried behind boxes of outgrown toys, hidden in the sediment of their family history. Inside, hotel key sleeves, receipts under a different email, and one loyalty card with Dana's handwriting scrawled across the back. A single number tied everything together. Her number, her hand. The thread was no longer invisible. Ethan didn't photograph the contents. He didn't shout or wave them like banners. Instead, he called his attorney. Within hours, a notary stood in his kitchen, calm and meticulous. Each item was signed, stamped, dated, folded into legitimacy by ink. No theatrics, no raised voices, just procedure, quiet, deliberate, unshakable. That evening, Dana came home with sushi. She placed the bag on the counter, offered an apology soft enough to sound harmless. "Sorry I'm late," she said, as if the word were just another syllable in a busy day. Ethan poured soy sauce into a dish, watched her hands tremble slightly when she reached for the wasabi. He measured the length of her pauses, the weight of her tones, and filed them silently away. Later, in the quiet of his study, he wrote it all down: time, tone, tremor. The morality clause wasn't a cudgel. It was a line the court would recognize, a line Dana had already crossed. And so Ethan began to rehearse sentences in private, not "I want," not "I deserve," but "our daughter needs." He understood now. Victory would not come from vengeance, but from the steady framing of stability. The city outside thrummed with neon and noise, but inside his kitchen, Ethan had shaped silence into something sharper than rage. Not a spectacle, not an explosion. A weapon the law would respect, ink on paper, patient and deliberate. The revelation did not come from a dramatic chase or whispered confession. It arrived in still frames, captured by the investigator's lens. Victor didn't live across town, cloaked in distance. He lived 2 floors above them, a secret hidden in plain sight. Convenience dressed up as coincidence. The stairwell bore the proof: Dana's figure climbing, Victor's hand on the rail behind her. Both of them laughing, careless in a building where walls were thin. Roof access logs confirmed their late-night meetings, hidden under stars but tethered to maintenance reports and security timestamps. Romance, if it could even be called that, was reduced to paperwork. Ethan studied the photographs without flinching. Anger rose, but discipline pressed it back. He didn't storm upstairs. He didn't pound on doors. Instead, he scheduled mediation. He arrived with 3 binders in his arms: facts, proposals, child. Sterile black ink on white paper, carrying the weight of weeks spent cataloging betrayal. Dana entered with Fiona at her side, her smile sharpened into something almost legal. The mediator read the rules: respectful voices, structured turns, documents over diatribes. Ethan abided. He opened his binder and let the timestamps speak. Numbers replaced adjectives. Patterns replaced accusations. Dana's face shifted through the theater of denial, shock, outrage, bargaining. Each act of her performance fell flatter than the last. Fiona leaned forward, voice low and dangerous, threatening harassment claims as though intimidation could erase ink. Ethan's attorney didn't blink. She asked for dates. She asked for specifics. She asked whether Fiona preferred to state them under oath. Bluff collided with paper. Silence followed, the kind only truth can enforce. Ethan's proposal was simple: his daughter's home preserved, her school uninterrupted, her mornings untouched. No spectacle, no public bloodletting, just stability, predictability. A life that still made sense for a child too young to understand betrayal. Dana refused, pride drowned reason. Fiona left first, too quickly, her eyes lingering on the binder labeled child. For a moment, even she seemed to grasp which stack of paper carried the most gravity. Ethan breathed deeply, steady, deliberate. He wasn't chasing an admission. He wasn't begging for confession. He didn't need Dana to say the word. The court would see the map, and the map was already drawn. Exposure has a way of shifting the lights on a stage. What once stood in shadow now moved to the center, illuminated and undeniable. Fiona, once the sympathetic book club friend who sipped Merlot in their living room and laughed about fictional husbands, was no bystander at all. Her messages surfaced through lawful channels, and with them came a truth sharper than rumor. She wasn't just present, she was orchestrating. The premium circle, as it called itself, wasn't intimacy. It was infrastructure. A subscription network designed for secrecy, selling discretion like a product. Fiona managed it with the efficiency of a corporate executive. Onboarding policies, referral bonuses for new members, tiered privileges for hosts and guests. This wasn't the language of passion, it was the language of logistics, and somehow that made it worse. The perks flowed through company credit cards, disguised as wellness retreats and morale events. Embezzlement dressed in euphemism. For a while it looked tidy, but fraud never stays hidden for long. HR began whispering. Internal memos surfaced. Receipts stacked higher than excuses. Ethan resisted the human urge to gloat. He didn't narrate the discovery like a victory. He didn't post articles or savor gossip. He remembered his attorney's words, restraint builds credibility. So he simply handed over what was required and stopped there. His folders swelled with invoices, confirmation emails, loyalty numbers, many written in Dana's own hand. Patterns that had once been private now lived in daylight. What cut deepest wasn't only the affair. It was the machinery behind it, the architecture of betrayal. Intimacy industrialized, reduced to schedules and spreadsheets. His family, his marriage, his daughter's stability, all swept into a machine that turned love into transactions. One evening, while Dana prepared dinner, her phone lit up across the room. Ethan didn't move, didn't touch it. He only read the preview glowing on the screen. Fiona's name. The message, we need to control the narrative. Ethan almost laughed. There was no narrative left to control. The story was already inked, signed by timestamps, sealed by receipts, and filed in binders no threat could erase. The numbers arrived without drama, and that was what made them dangerous. A forensic accountant hired through Ethan's attorney began to turn Dana's Thursdays into ledgers. Each rideshare timestamp matched neatly with hotel charges. Spa add-ons appeared like punctuation marks scattered through her expense reports. Bar tabs filed under training sessions. Receipts coded as client morale. The pattern didn't accuse, it aligned. Every column marched in lockstep toward the same conclusion. The report was devastating because it was dull. No adjectives, no speculation. Just tables of dates, amounts, vendors, a cold architecture that whispered betrayal line by line. Dana's life no longer looked like a marriage split in two. It looked like double-entry bookkeeping, one column for her husband and child, another for the man upstairs. Ethan stared at the spreadsheets, chest tightening. The cruelest betrayals weren't messy, he realized. They were organized. Meanwhile, Victor lived loudly online. He called himself a relationship coach, filling his feed with slogans about honesty and intimacy. Videos edited with bright filters, preaching communication while his private life contradicted every frame. A local blog picked up the irony, posting side-by-side screenshots. His smiling face beside whispers of hotel rooms and loyalty points. The piece wasn't conclusive, but dissonance has a way of catching fire. Ethan didn't share the link. He didn't send it to friends or indulge in the sweetness of public shame. He kept his hands clean. His work remained in binders, not gossip threads. Dana's firm, however, noticed. Expense reports under client morale were flagged. Compliance officers circled charges. HR requested clarifications. At the same time, the hotel's loyalty program, under pressure from investigators, released anonymized usage data, dates, floor numbers, lengths of stay. Names redacted, but the lattice was undeniable when Ethan's attorney laid them over his timelines. Anonymous numbers became coordinates. Coordinates became proof. And in the quiet between tasks, grief returned like a shadow. He would glance at the pantry labeler Dana once insisted they buy, a relic of their domestic teamwork. He would remember the vacation they postponed twice, telling themselves next year. He would hear her laugh echo from movies they once shared. Grief didn't paralyze him. It reminded him what was lost and why he had to protect what remained. Ethan filed the accountant's report into his binder, closed the cover, and exhaled. Suspicion was long behind him. Now there was only fact, and facts, unlike people, do not lie. The second round of mediation began with an empty chair. Fiona's absence spoke louder than her presence ever had, a silent admission that even allies retreat when the heat rises. Dana arrived with a lawyer at her side, posture stiff, voice rehearsed. She didn't bring binders of evidence. She brought a story. Words softened at the edges, tested phrases like trial separation and non-monogamy exploration, as if rebranding could repaint receipts and overwrite timestamps. Ethan didn't argue. He didn't rise to definitions. Instead, he slid a calendar across the table. 90 days marked not with suspicions, but with facts. Every dentist appointment he attended alone, every school concert where he clapped from the second row, every conference where he sat in the folding chair meant for both parents. Each date was quiet, undeniable, harder than any accusation. The room shifted. Euphemisms drained out like water from a cracked glass. Children don't fit into adult vocabulary designed to soften shame. A child either has a parent at 7:00 p.m. or doesn't. A backpack is either checked before bed or left forgotten on the stairs. These truths required no adjectives. Ethan's custody proposal grew sharper, not crueler. Primary residence at his address. School night stability. Weekends designed around routine, not chaos. Financial terms folded in the morality clause from the prenup. Precise and plain. Misused funds tied line by line to receipts. The document stood where anger might have raged, quiet but unshakable. Dana's lawyer asked for time, a pause to review, perhaps to regroup. Dana herself shifted tones, her practiced strength slipping into softness. She asked for understanding. Ethan gave her silence instead. Silence and a non-negotiable truth. His daughter's mornings would not be bargained away. The mediator took notes quietly, head tilted as if measuring the difference between posture and paper. On one side, a man who refused to perform rage even when rage was justified. On the other, a woman who struggled to perform innocence even when innocence was demanded. In the end, it wasn't speeches that carried weight. It was the stack of binders, the inked calendars, the signatures waiting at the margins. Paper won where stories failed. The downfall didn't begin in a courtroom or an office. It began online, in a place where narratives unravel faster than they can be spun. Victor launched a truth thread, long paragraphs about being misunderstood, about privacy invaded, about relationships too complex for outsiders to judge. For a few hours it worked. People liked, people shared. But the internet is not loyal. By nightfall, receipts surfaced. Screenshots of chat threads, blurry hotel photos, tagged locations that matched Ethan's calendar. What Victor intended as a defense turned into an archive of hypocrisy. Sponsors who once applauded his brand of radical honesty quietly pulled their logos. Clients requested refunds. His feed filled with silence where endorsements had been. Dana didn't escape either. At her firm, compliance officers widened their scope. What began as a quiet review of client morale, charges expanded into a full-scale inquiry. Expense reports flagged. Duplicate reimbursements highlighted. Hotel bills coded as training sessions circled in red. In the sterile language of corporate memos, her world narrowed into bullet points of misconduct. The hotel's loyalty program, pressured by investigators, released anonymized usage data. No names, only dates and floors. But when those numbers were laid over Ethan's binders, the shape was too clear to ignore. Anonymous records sang the same song as his meticulous notes. Ethan chose silence. He ignored direct messages offering gossip. He declined invitations to fuel rumor. At home, he enforced a new rule: no phones at dinner. His daughter laughed at how serious he sounded when he said it, but he meant it. He was building a reputation not of scandal, but of stability. A man who wouldn't burn down his own house, even when handed the matchbook. Dana felt the shift. Her tone softened. Her pitch changed. She suggested counseling, reconciliation for the child. Ethan agreed to co-parenting therapy because their daughter deserved structure, but refused to rewrite the past. Mercy and memory could coexist, he realized, but coexistence wasn't erasure. Forgiveness could not mean pretending the betrayal had never existed. Outside their walls, the story grew louder: headlines, threads, articles. Inside, Ethan's home grew quieter. And in family law, quiet is the strongest argument of all. Retaliation came dressed in paperwork. Dana filed a complaint, alleging unlawful surveillance, hoping to recast Ethan as the aggressor rather than the quiet recorder he had been. The documents were thick with legal phrasing, a narrative built to blur the line between suspicion and intrusion. For a brief moment, it seemed dangerous. Allegations are often louder than truth, at least in their first telling. The first hearing lasted minutes. Dana's counsel spoke of violations, of privacy crossed, of a husband gone too far. But then a neighbor stepped forward with a flash drive. Inside, hallway audio captured accidentally by a baby monitor perched outside their apartment door. The timing matched precisely the night Dana swore she was homesick. The recording wasn't dramatic. Footsteps, muted laughter. The ding of the elevator at 11 a.m., ordinary sounds, but ordinary was enough. Ordinary erased extraordinary lies. Judge leaned back, unimpressed. Dana's counsel faltered, realizing the case had collapsed under its own weight. Before a ruling could even be given, the complaint was withdrawn. Silence settled like a curtain falling too soon. Ethan didn't smirk. He didn't gloat. Instead, he took his daughter out for pancakes, watching her drown them in syrup, listening as she chattered about a school project. Relief wasn't triumphant. It was steady, humming in the background like soft music. Later, he emailed his attorney a short thank you, a message that read more like a diary entry than legal correspondence. Gratitude tempered with exhaustion. In private, grief returned. Not grief for the case, he had won that. Grief for the woman who might have told the truth the first time. For the Dana who once laughed beside him in grocery aisles, who might have admitted fault before evidence forced her hand. That Dana was gone, replaced by someone who weaponized paperwork instead of honesty. In public, he kept to one sentence: "We're working through it." No elaboration, no bitterness. Consistency mattered more than spectacle. People trusted steady, and Ethan was steady. When the investigator closed the file, the final note was clinical, objectives met. Yet in Ethan's mind, it read like a benediction. He hadn't chosen this war, but he had survived its first counterstrike without losing himself. The courtroom was colder than the hallway outside, a chill that came not from vents but from gravity. The benches smelled faintly of varnish and dust. Ethan entered without spectacle, binders tucked under his arm, his step steady. He had rehearsed this moment in silence, no speeches, no anger, no flames, just pages, numbered, dated, signed. When the hearing opened, Dana's counsel tried to set a tone of misunderstanding. Words like miscommunication, complexity, floated through the air but dissolved quickly. The judge leaned forward, unimpressed. Adjectives meant nothing here. Calendars mattered, receipts mattered, bank statements mattered. Ethan placed his binders on the table. Tabs spoke more clearly than his voice ever could. March, hotel receipts aligned with late-night absences. April, expense reports flagged as training and client entertainment. May, rideshare data, timestamps cross-checked with loyalty logs, each page initialed, each section signed, not accusation, architecture. The morality clause from the prenup clicked into place like a lock. Misused funds weren't speculation. They were listed item by item: room charges, spa services, duplicate meals. Each strike of the judge's pen severed dollars from the marital pool, reassigning them with quiet precision. But custody remained the center. The judge's questions weren't about who had suffered. They were about who had structured. Ethan answered with mornings, drop-offs logged, teacher emails printed, dentist receipts stapled. He said, "Our child more often than my rights." The difference mattered. Dana's counsel tried to widen the lens, to argue fairness, to soften consequences. But the map Ethan had drawn since that first Tuesday held firm. School night stability with him, structured weekends, neutral exchanges, predictability repeated like a drumbeat. Dana's lawyer shifted, asking for dignity, phrasing in the decree visitation terms that saved face. Ethan granted what he could at the edges. He didn't need to grind her into dust. He only needed the foundation to hold. The judge noticed. The mediator nodded, pen scratching quiet approval. When the session ended, Ethan didn't feel triumphant. He felt level, as though the tilted floor of the past months had finally steadied beneath him. Outside, the courthouse doors opened to late afternoon light, sharp and ordinary. Ethan paused in his car before turning the key, hands heavy on the wheel. He breathed in silence, the kind built not on denial but on structure. Traffic moved in predictable lines, and for the first time in a long while, so did his life. It began with whispers and ended with subpoenas. The so-called premium circle, once spoken of only in euphemism, was dragged into daylight by investigators who cared nothing for discretion, only for data. Membership logs subpoenaed. Payment records surfaced. Rumors that once lived in shadows now lived in spreadsheets, highlighted in yellow. Fiona tried to move faster than the scandal. She resigned one day before her firm issued termination papers, hoping to preserve a fragment of control. But corporate leaks move at the speed of humiliation. A memo naming her role in funneling company funds into wellness events slipped to the press before the week was out. Her resignation looked less like choice and more like retreat. Victor's collapse followed swiftly. His brand had always been brittle, built on slogans of honesty while his nights told another story. Sponsors pulled logos. Event organizers canceled bookings. Within weeks, his speaking calendar emptied. A man who once sold faith in relationships now stood as a cautionary tale in hypocrisy. Dana's name appeared too, printed not in gossip columns but in compliance reports. Transactions coded as client morale aligned with hotel receipts. In the gray tone of corporate memos, her affair was stripped of secrecy and dressed in accounting jargon. She was no longer the woman humming in their kitchen. She was a premium member on a list handed to regulators. The public conversation surged, hashtags spiked, then faded. Internet cycles always move on, but institutional consequences move slower. Investigations don't forget. HR emails arrived clipped and cold. Meetings turned into interrogations. Coworkers avoided her eyes in the cafeteria. Ethan did not cheer. He did not forward links or savor the spectacle. He didn't need enemies punished to feel whole. What he needed was smaller, steadier, mornings his daughter could trust. Yet he couldn't ignore the practical weight of collapse. Every headline affirmed the map he had drawn. Every resignation erased another bluff in mediation. Every memo shortened future hearings because denial had no room left to breathe. At night, Ethan clipped articles, printed memos, slid them behind a new tab in his binder labeled context. Context was not vengeance, it was compass. Facts marched, steady and silent, until even the loudest liars could not keep pace. The envelope looked ordinary, just a white rectangle that could have held anything. A utility bill, a dentist reminder, a flyer slipped under the door. But in Dana's trembling hands, it felt heavier than paper should. Inside was termination for cause. No accusations, no moral outrage. Just the dry cadence of institutions, policy numbers, contract clauses, procedural findings, benefits revoked, severance denied, access terminated. Her world shrank in a single page. What had once been projects, colleagues, and promotions was now reduced to checklists and forms. Meetings were no longer about advancement, but about exit protocols. Passwords revoked, property retrieval scheduled. Boxes stacked in a hallway that smelled of fluorescent dust. She no longer carried authority. She carried cardboard. Ethan didn't weaponize the letter. He could have waved it like a banner, taped it to her shame. Instead, he filed it, slipped neatly into a tab labeled Final. Then he recalculated budgets, shifting into a one-household life that no longer apologized for its stability. Mortgage, groceries, school supplies, arithmetic had always been on his side. And yet memory still reached for him. He thought of the road trip they once planned, postponed, and abandoned. He could almost hear the playlist Dana had built, songs chosen for miles they never drove. One evening, he sat at his desk and typed a sentence he would never send. "I wanted ordinary with you." He stared at it, then deleted it. Some mercies belonged only to silence. Instead, he turned to the work of building a different kind of ordinary. Pick-up times that didn't shift with excuses. Meal plans that meant dinner happened on schedule. A new desk for his daughter, wide enough for markers and construction paper, no longer crowded out by adult chaos. These were the victories that mattered, the quiet construction of a life his daughter could trust. The letter lay sealed in plastic, cold and clinical. But in the next room, his daughter's laughter echoed against the walls. Between those two sounds, Ethan chose which one would define the future. The decree arrived without ceremony. No gavel striking wood, no dramatic verdict, just paper signed and sealed in a room that smelled faintly of toner and coffee. The clerk slid it across the desk. Ethan signed his name, steady hand, then passed the pen to Dana. Her fingers trembled only once as she dated the last page. 15 years of marriage ended not with shouts but with ink. Dana moved into a smaller apartment across town, stripped of pretense. Their daughter's exchanges took place at the public library on Saturdays, chosen for its neutrality. Books, Ethan thought, made better witnesses than parking lots. The librarians nodded politely each week, understanding more than they ever said. Dana would kneel beside their daughter, smile thinly, hand over a tote bag filled with clothes or homework. Ethan would stand nearby, calm, steady, reliable. The ritual was predictable, almost liturgical. Back at the house, Ethan began the work of reclaiming. Not violently, not with bitterness, but gently. He stripped the bed, bought new sheets in pale blue instead of the white Dana had once chosen. He painted the hallway soft gray, covering the scuffs that had outlived too many arguments. On the refrigerator, he taped up a chore chart his daughter had drawn in careful handwriting, each square filling with stickers like small promises. The revenge he had once imagined, explosive, cinematic, was gone. What he held now was quieter, steadier. A lawful refusal to live in the dark. He didn't need Dana ruined. He needed mornings without lies, nights without suspicion. One evening, he opened a window. Cool air drifted in, carrying the sounds he once feared he had lost forever, the neighbor's dog barking at nothing, the chime of a bicycle bell, his daughter's laughter spilling from the kitchen, effortless, free of translation. He leaned against the sill and breathed. The story hadn't ended with a slammed door or a shouted curse. It ended here, in a room that finally felt honest. Silence was no longer dangerous. For the first time in years, the future stretched forward without a villain at its center. And that, Ethan realized, was the truest form of victory. That was the silver secret, a marriage undone not by shouting, but by timestamps, ledgers, and a window open to honest air. Ethan didn't chase vengeance. He protected mornings, calendars, and a child's quiet. The lesson is simple and heavy. Betrayal has a paper trail, and the strongest revenge is a stable life. What would you have done differently? Confront sooner or map the truth like Ethan did? Tell me your take below. If this story hit close to home like the video, subscribe to Cheating Stories 7 and share it with someone who needs a reminder that calm wins. See you in the next story.